Good morning. This is Faith in Our Hometown, brought to you as a community service and sponsored by Mercy Hospital, Joplin. And now, here's your host, Father Jay Friedel.
Well, welcome back to week 2 on Faith in Our Hometown on our Sociology of Religion discussion. My guest last week and this week is Dr. Conrad Gubera, who's at Missouri Southern University and teaches Sociology of Religion. He's a sociologist and teaches that there at Southern. Last week, as kind of a recap for everyone, we talked a little bit about the bigger view of how we would look at the macro level, if you will, if you want to use that big fancy word, of looking at things from a bigger picture so that we can kind of break things apart in a little bit of way. This week we're going to actually do something that we weren't planning on doing, but in our discussions it's kind of rolled into this. I think this could be really a lot of fun for us to talk in some ways about how, at this level, how some of these things came to play themselves out in Joplin itself. So we're going to be talking about, again, about the sociology of religion, how that came to play itself out in the Joplin area. So we're going to hope that intrigues you. We hope you're going to stick with us. We're going to be right back after this Mercy Minute, Faith in Our Hometown.
Once I quit playing football, I still kept up with the eating, the amount of calories I wasn't exercising, so the weight started adding on. Dr. Lou is very knowledgeable in the work he does. He also has a program set up that has support systems in place for you. You'll go through the seminar at first. He'll give you the different examples of surgeries you can have to see which one works best with you. He will also sit down with you and discuss the options, what he feels, but he'll work with you the entire time. Mercy has their gastric bypass program here. They have all kinds of resources and support systems in place. They want to see you succeed, and they're here to help you the entire time, even after the surgery.
Well, again, thanks for joining us for another Sunday morning at Faith in Our Hometown. My guest again, Dr. Conrad Gubera from Missouri Southern. Dr. Gubera, we were making some comments after taping the last segment, and we were talking about this, and I just think this is going to be fascinating for our viewers to start talking about how this sociology of religion, how this played itself out, how we organized ourselves, and how we grew by what we learned as an early Joplin community. So say a little bit about that. I think they're going to love this.
Well, it all ties into really a sense of history and time. We know that Joplin got started in 1873 as far as the founding date was concerned. And, there were more saloons than there were churches in the beginning.
Right. Big
and this was a mining
rough
town.
And tumble. Yeah, you got it.
Yeah, see? And a lot of the men were single, and a lot of the men, for instance, their needs and various needs had to be met in certain kind of ways. And I always found it interesting that the early memoirs of the miners, and certainly some of the writings of Joplin, indicated that many of the bars that had been certainly open on Saturday night were swept out, cleaned up, closed, and you had church services in the morning. In fact, I always tell students that Joplin itself has got this real religious connection with the Reverend Harris Joplin. Was that his name, I believe? Mm-hmm. He was a Bush Methodist minister, riding around from community to community. Circuit rider, that's what it was, see? And he'd baptize and he'd marry, for instance, those people living together but hadn't had the blessings of the priest yet, goodness, and then, he'd carry out that business and eat a good meal or two, and he'd be off, for instance, somewhere else. And so I think Reverend Harris Joplin, that's how we came by this name between Murfreesburg and, the other little area that was in East Joplin at that particular time. But the real focus comes to bear on Joplin because in the 1880s and 90s, in the early part, from I'd say 1880 through about beginning of World War II, 1915, there was a whole movement, for instance, called the Progressive Movement in American history. That really catches us in Joplin right in the middle of it. And this was a time, for instance, in which there was no social work programs, no welfare as far as the federal government or any level of government. Right. So it depended upon charity and Christian charity and goodwill. And so growing up in the middle of this time was also, for instance, just wide open. There wasn't any kind of income tax and not very good controls on the robber barons and the industrial lords and so forth. But their wives and their daughters began to spend, for instance, the old man's money, if I may use that expression, for instance,
sure.
in doing good. And we call that the social gospel movement. And in the wake of that, for instance, the Catholics, for instance, came to town, as well as some of the other missionaries, for instance, to do well, to open, for instance, homes for unwed mothers, to open the hospital, to open schools as far as children are concerned, see?
Yep.
And certainly, I always look at one of the really key things that the progressive movement and the social gospel did was produce the juvenile court and get a very separate, set of hearings as far as juveniles procedures were concerned, separating them out from the adult procedures, whereas before they'd been treated as adults. Well, in the midst of this, then, you have certainly, of course, for instance, the blooming of Joplin. And I always think in terms of Joplin's first millionaire. What was his name? Certainly, he built St. Peter's Catholic Church. Tom O'Connor. Yeah, he changed it to Tom Connor. But he built more than St. Peter's. He built 2 or 3 other churches, particularly for the black people of Joplin, for instance, just simply out of his own
pocket. A lot of those
pockets.
downtown churches are still there.
Yeah, you can see his name on it.
Yep, exactly.
You can see his name on the top of it. And so here was a man, for instance, that would take and put his money into this kind of venture as far as true charity was concerned. And as a result, as more and more of the people who spent money, for instance, in this came from the denominational churches. We're talking about, for instance, the Episcopalian churches and the Presbyterian churches, and Catholics weren't doing too bad, for instance, the Lutheran churches. There were a lot of the poorer churches that couldn't afford this kind of ministry, and so in the reaction, they began, for instance, to become really, really fundamentalists in their preaching and fundamentalists in their teaching, saying, it's not these good works that people are doing. You don't get into heaven that way, but you get into heaven by believing more about the gospel and, living it and interpreting it through sort of maybe a hellfire and brimstone kind of interpretation. And as a result, during that period then, just hundreds of different sectarian churches were created, and particularly in the Midwest, which we refer to as the Bible Belt. Local, controlled, kind of their own agenda, and certainly what you got to do is believe, see? And certainly, you or I might have been seen as an anathema to them because we would represent a hierarchy. You would tie it into a bishop, and I represent education. If you were a good old boy, you knew the gospel really well, or at least the Bible relatively well, and you were called to preach.
Yeah.
And the Bible was still being used even at times, for instance, in rural schools at that time as a basic book. Now, before the Civil War, it was a basic book as far as school systems were concerned, because we had no publishing companies. We had nothing, for instance, like, Wiley and Sons and all that sort of thing.
Exactly.
So Simon and Schulze, and that all comes after the Civil War. And so in this great thrust for public education, where every township has, 36 square miles, a little school, little one-room country school, I went to one. I had 6 years in a country school. I think we had something like 12 students the last year I was there in 1953.
Now, you grew up in this area, so where was that?
Toward Pierce City, Missouri, between Pierce City, Missouri and Diamond, Missouri, out in
go.
rural hinterland, to say the least, see? So every township had to have a little school, and the sale of that 1 mile of land was to help build a school and to then offset and then charge school taxes. And it's during this time, in this progressive period, where the high schools get invented. And certainly, of course, then you begin to have vocational aspects of the high schools and the boys' club, the girls' club, certainly YMCA, YWCA, all of that sort of thing begins to be invented at this particular time, see? In the midst of this, it's exciting, for instance, is this charity work going on as far as certainly the social gospel. That's when, the sisters come to town, and that's when, for instance, the children's home, for instance, which was big, and some of the hospitals, obviously, for instance, that specialized. We had pneumonia hospitals around here. That was a real problem, for instance. And I get excited about that because it was people really trying to put their money up to do God's work. The reaction to that from the people who didn't have money was to become, for instance, more, what do we call them today, very fundamental and very interpretive as far as the gospel is concerned. And they represented, for instance, perhaps maybe the more working class people as far as their incomes.
Yeah, so to me I mean that was a quick snapshot, but to me it's always fascinating to me, especially when we start taking what we can look at from this large view and start looking at it more the way it actually unfolded and even not even just here in the Joplin area. I mean, I think it was a great snapshot of Joplin, but I mean, Missouri was it had such an effect on the religious history of the western part of the United States.
Oh,
we always laughed over at Southeast that we wanted to just teach up and down the river valley because of all the things that happened in the river valley. Beginning of Methodism in the United States, beginning of Missouri Synod Lutherans, and some of that direction. Certainly the Mormons, in terms of coming to be an independence and some of those things. The Catholics, in terms of our big with the Louisiana expansion and the way that was all getting going, at different points in time.
It's the Frenchmen.
Oh yeah. So I mean, we always just used to laugh and say, we wanted to just teach a course on, what the Mississippi River Valley had done for, Western religion, for religion in the western part of the United States.
Yeah,
so I love it. I love having this little snapshot of Joplin because, again, you were helping me connect the dots this morning.
I'm not exactly sure which church, had the first was erected in Joplin. Whether it was a Methodist, it might have probably been Methodist because the Methodists had the greatest proselytization and the greatest expansion in the frontier areas.
Right.
And later on, of course, the Baptists, particularly after the Civil War, for instance, because they had that North-South thing as far as the Civil War is concerned, which separated Southern Baptists from the American Baptists. But always in the history of religion, we see out on the frontier, the Methodists really were at work.
Well, and when you go and look at the for example, the cornerstones of some of the places of the downtown churches. Like I say, I know we had our first masses, Catholic masses here in Joplin in 1877.
There you go.
Okay, again, but that was just missionaries traveling through, much like those Methodist preachers were doing the same thing. They were all traveling through. Nobody was making a foothold here in this, mining town. But by 1900. And we were already, by the time 1905 hit, and all those downtown churches were being built.
That's right.
That God love Mr. Connor was donating to all of them.
That's right.
Because he was trying to see Joplin grow into a real city, not just a mining camp, but a real city.
Exactly.
And watching all those things happen. And so, and that just fits in so well with what we were talking about last week in terms of one of the ways that society.
Well, now let's not divorce Joplin, because in Joplin there were families. And then there were religions with churches, and then of course there were the schools eventually with the first high school, and I think we're just celebrating, for instance, 100 years of the Memorial High School building, see? And then of course Joplin was well founded on a mining economy, and then had to make some transitions and has done rather well in all things considered, see, from a mining economy. And then we've always had the municipal and local government who runs things. And of course, Mr. O'Connor wasn't very big into politics. He didn't like that. But he was kind of a power broker behind the scenes, see, and that's always interesting. But the richness of religion is when it reaches out and touches people's heart and provides a service for them that these other institutions aren't doing. And in the absence of any kind of welfare, any kind of social work programs that were later on endorsed by the New Deal under Franklin Delano Roosevelt during the Great Depression of the 1930s, in the absence of that, religion stepped forward at this particular point, and I thought did a remarkable job, even though the reaction to it was this fundamentalistic fervor then that came away from it, saying, no, you got to know the Bible. It's just not social work. It's going to get you into heaven, but knowing the Bible.
Well, we're having a great discussion this morning again in our part 2 of Sociology of Religion. We're not finished yet, but we are going to take a quick break here in a minute and then come back and talk a little bit more about how religion kind of organizes itself and how they're practiced. Some of those things here in our second half this morning. So this is Faith in Our Hometown. Don't go away. We're going to be right back after a real quick break.
You're watching Faith in Our Hometown on KSN TV, brought to you as a community service and sponsored by Mercy Hospital, Joplin.
Well, again, thanks for sticking with us on another Sunday morning. My guest, Dr. Conrad Gubera, professor of sociology at Missouri Southern. We've been talking about the sociology of religion. This morning we started talking about how that kind of organized itself in Joplin. But let's go back to, kind of like a little bit of a broader, let's broaden back out a little bit here and look at how religion kind of organizes itself, how it's practiced. and all those different elements, because these were always some of the fascinating things to my students when I'd be teaching world religions about the different pieces. How does religion, look? How does it organize itself? Rituals, prayers, scriptures, all that stuff.
Very good. You've got to love prayers.
Well, I do, but
If religion did nothing else to teach us how to pray, I think would be one of the most fundamental and beloved aspects as far as religion is concerned.
Yeah.
Because it allows us to express our needs, our wants, our fears, our hopes, our joys. And let's always remember for Thanksgiving, we study in the sociology of religion, there are about 5 things that prayer will do. And I can't take them off, but one of them, we're always seemingly asking for something, God grant us this, or, thy will be done. If it's thy will, for instance, And we can have the best doctor and the surgeons in the world, but we're going to go down to the chapel and pray. And I always find Emile Durkheim, the original professor of sociology at the University of Paris in the 1890s, got the first PhD in sociology awarded by the University of Paris by studying suicide, by the way, for instance, and doing a real classic study as far as cause and effect relationships as measured by a science and measured by questionnaires and interviews and so forth. By 1906, he was writing a lot about religion and the effect as far as religion. And he was of the opinion that certainly kind of in the middle are human beings. On one side is the sacred and the other side is the profane. On one side, for instance, is God, and on the other side is science. On one side, for instance, is faith, and on the other side, for instance, facts. And we in the middle, for instance, kind of like an accordion, would sway back and forth between one. Yeah, I want the best surgeon to operate on my dad, but I'm not going to just simply trust him. I'm going to go down to the chapel and I'm going to pray my heart out for it.
Right.
And in that respect, for instance, we see, for instance, between the sacred and the profane. Now, the neat thing about that, this probably goes into all religions of the world.
Right.
You probably have your humble, and you maybe have, for instance, that same sort of thing going on, even in I dare say, for instance, your naturalistic religions. I'm sure, for instance, that people participated in the great hunting dance and so forth, and did everything they possibly could, but to make this work. But at the same time, they had their skills, and they had to hone in on those skills, see, and to empower us, because we're pretty feeble, as people. To empower us is a beautiful thing of prayer, and certainly, of course, what we see in the psychological and the support aspects of religion.
Yeah, and and that's been, I think, it comes out in so many different ways in different theologies of the different religions. One of my favorite ways that it comes out in Catholicism was, St. Ignatius of Loyola, when he would basically say, when you go to pray, pray as though everything, or when you go to work, work as though everything depended upon you. But when you go to pray, you better pray as though everything depended upon God.
Wonderful. Well said. Truly.
And it was just like, so he was kind of like, very practical. And again, those 2 things, of course we try to control what we can control. But I think that there's always been, and again, getting back to what we were talking about last week in terms of the way we kind of think through things, there are those moments when we just have to come to some terms for ourselves, all of us, no matter who we are. And we have to say, okay, but there's something here that's beyond my control. There's something here that just is, what I believe, or what my hunch is, or what I've come to believe, or what's been passed on to me that's bigger than what I can control.
And why do we call it the Lord's Prayer? That is one of the most perfect, balanced prayers you will ever find in any religion, because it praises, it asks, it gives thanksgiving, it beseeches, and certainly, of course, it extols God in God's greater glory. And I tell students unabashedly that if anyone ever asks you what is the most universal set of words that are known around the world, unabashedly say the Lord's Prayer. Because there are 2.5 billion Christians in the world, if not more than that. And I don't know of a Christian that doesn't know the Lord's Prayer.
Well, I would like to think that there probably aren't any, because we wouldn't be doing a very good job of passing on Christianity if we didn't pass that on.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah. See, and yet, I know I have students sometimes analyze the Lord's Prayer, and it's really a fascinating example that they will give, because I'll ask them to find the 5 basic points in the prayer and how they interpret it. And boy, the students, they really seem to get a lot out of it. I dare say, that is just fundamental as far as faith and belief. But how do you pray? For instance, have you Have you grown in your faith enough in God that you can just express yourself and talk to God? Can you talk, for instance, you know, to your patron saint? Do you know how to talk to God? Or do you have to say always the Lord's Prayer? Or can you say, God, you know what's in my heart. You know what I long for. You know what mystifies me.
And again, I think that sometimes cuts in with those different levels, because I mean, I think when we go to organize, it's easy to organize around the words or the rituals or those kinds of things. But again, as I'm fond of saying, you know, if I just teach people what the schema is and what all the rituals and all the prayers are, but don't teach them how to tap into that other level, that more personal level, the elevator doesn't go up and down the right way.
Exactly
you
right.
know? The elevator doesn't go where it needs to go for everybody in order to do that. And I'm sure that's the same thing if I were talking to the folks at the synagogue, they're going to tell me the same thing. Or if I'm talking to our brothers and sisters out at the mosque, they're going to do the same thing. Or if we talk to our Baha'i brothers and sisters in the area, I mean, those are some universals, and that's again where this sociology of religion kind of taps in at that meta level that that each one of us can take our traditions and see how those things work for us. I do want to segue here for just a second. I've got about 5 minutes left, and I do want to talk about one of those things we kind of tossed out as as a teaser at the end of the last show we taped, and that is this whole concept of how do we approach things at the end of life, and how we approach things at death, and what are some of the sociological? Because I mean, you also teach a course on death and dying, and I mean, and this is, trust me, every university I've ever been around, everyone I've ever taught with, all my friends who teach these courses across the country, will say that the course on death and dying is probably one of the most fascinating courses for our students.
I have 45 students in it right now, teaching it this semester, and it's one of the largest classes, if not the largest in the department.
Yeah. So say a little bit about how religion taps into that whole idea of where we are at the end of life in terms of death and dying.
Well, remember, in our first program, those universal ideas, the universal, what we call them, social institutions. However, we said that religion was predicated upon those ideas or those questions that we couldn't answer. Who am I? Where did I come from? What am I supposed to be doing here? What happens to me after I die? See? And so that is where universally the religions really have had, for instance, impact upon the human race, the human family across the world. Because I don't know of a religion that doesn't deal with death.
Right.
And doesn't encounter
because that
death.
does seem to be one of those universal things about us as human beings.
We know we're going to die.
Exactly.
We may be the only species on the planet to know we're going to die.
Well, philosophically, we think that. I mean, that so far we're the only ones that we know of.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
We'll see.
And so that opens up this chasm, and this opens up, for instance, all kinds of curiosities, many times fears, and obviously, for instance, certainly, of course, innumerable questions. Religions, and particularly Christianity, offers us immortality.
Well, not. I could quibble with that and say not the religion itself, but we think that the God behind the
That's notwithstanding, of course, But the religion, the interpretation of God through Christianity, offers us immortality. And I know of no other world religion. Challenge me on this, if you please. For instance, that spends more time relating to death or discussing death or having a series of rituals for the death, unless it might be the Buddhists, but nevertheless, for instance, than Christianity, because the single feature of Christianity is the death of Jesus Christ.
And it's a central figure. So I mean, I think it is fair to say, from a comparative religion standpoint, that is one of the things that Christianity certainly has in spades. In terms of just it's one of those things you can't get away from. The cross, symbol of Jesus' death, but you can't ever talk about his death without also talking about his resurrection.
Exactly.
It's right there. But I will say that, again, in all the other, in many of the other world traditions that there are, there is the capacity to deal with that, and with many, they do believe that there is some kind of a form of what is next.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
I mean, that's fundamental to all the religions. I don't mean to in any way, certainly not indicate that, but Christianity, it's certainly more present as far as a major theme, because Christ came to earth, to show us the pathway through resurrection of the life and the spirit of life, for instance, in heaven with his Father. See? Yeah. And gosh, if I were a Hindu, I'd simply say, well, this life is transitory. I'll get another one. You know, I'll get another model, and based upon my good karma or bad karma in this life and how well I fulfill the traditions, I'll either, certainly come back up or down as far as certainly reincarnation is concerned.
Yeah,
see?
knowing that you're going to be on that cycle for a long time yet. Yeah.
Yes, and if I'm a real good Islam, I'm going to say, I know that death is permanent, and I need to prepare my life, for that permanency, which means to follow the pathway and the teachings of God.
That's right.
Not of man, but of God, as laid out, for instance, in the sacred Quran, which, by the way, is so woefully misinterpreted today.
Oh my gosh, yes. And we've had the imam on, and we've talked about that a little bit. It's been a long time, so we need to have him on again soon, because we just haven't talked to him in a little while. And it's always enlightening when he comes and it does that. Again, it's one of the reasons why, Dr. Gubera, why we started the show in the first place, is again here in our area to promote that understanding that we need to learn how to talk to each other better, because so many of us in this area are proponents of religion. So many of us practice a faith of some kind, and yet we're so many times running around without any real good understanding of each other. So that's one of the things that we want to continue to do. We are going to be right back after this Mercy Minute. Don't go away.
The SANE program, or Sexual Assault Nurse Examiner program, is a program established to provide a coordinated, specialized care to patients or women or men who've been the victim of sexual assault.
The SANE program is really designed to be a collaborative community response to sexual assault.
It's really important to make sure that it's not just the report or the forensic, but they get all of the testing that might be needed for their health.
It's also important to know that you don't need to know if you want to press charges or not. We don't get law enforcement involved unless you request it.
I just want to express to the victim that it is never your fault. You always have the right to say no, and that it's your body. So if you say yes one time, it doesn't mean every time.
I think it's important that sexual assault victims remember they've been victims of a crime, and crime victims do not pay for those services.
Well, we hope you've enjoyed this 2-week arc that we've done on the sociology of religion, and I really thank Dr. Conrad Gubera for being here with us to lead us in some good thoughts, so to kind of just stir the pot, if it will, as we learn how to talk to each other. We do have a blessing in this area that most people practice faith of some kind, and even those that don't, know that there's an importance for us to talk to each other so that we can still live as good citizens here in Joplin together and figure out how we can make our way forward together. It's one of the ways that we organize our society, as we've been talking about for the last 2 weeks. And religion is going to be a part of that, that's just part of the reality that we have organized ourselves by for many years. We are blessed here in the Joplin area in that we got lots of good churches, we've got lots of good groups, we got lots of people of goodwill who want to come together and have those conversations to figure out how we can do this better together. Many of us are convinced that we are better when we're together than we are when we're all separate. And that is one of the things that we continue to challenge ourselves with as we continue to move forward here in our greater Joplin area, if you will. Please come back and join us again next week for Faith in Our Hometown. Thanks for being with us, and thanks for being faithful viewers. Send us your comments, and have a great week.
Thanks for watching. Faith in Our Hometown can be seen Sunday mornings at 6:30 and 9 a.m. on KSN. Brought to you as a community service and sponsored by Mercy Hospital, Joplin.